girls and more increasingly gender diverse people, as we recognize that gender equity, which is our ultimate goal, is really as inclusive as we can get, and there are many groups that are still facing oppression. To me, it's just that safety means that condition where you are feeling at peace and you're protected in all the spheres and where you are, you exist. And that could be at home, that's on the street, that's in the workplace, that's really everywhere where we are about and are trying to be what we can, the best that we can be. So if you are feeling protected and you are feeling like you are not facing any harms or dangers, and that can vary, to me, that's the feeling of safety. And as we know, and again, by virtue of the line of work that we do, that feeling has many facets and it is gendered. So as we talk about different groups of people and the feelings of safety, we know that, and this is things that we work on just day in and day out, the YWCA Canada and our 29 member associations across Canada, is that understanding. I think right now, if I took a poll and I asked every woman or gender diverse person if they had a safety plan, this is something that I know every single woman does. Do you, when you leave your place or you go to work or you're coming home at night, by show of hands, women, do you usually have a plan of what to do if something was to happen to you? Yes. Every single woman that I know does this. And this is unfair because we know that society and how we get socialized into being women and girls in whatever communities we live in, we're socialized to have that. It's a responsibility. Like, are you going to come home safe? We know many women go missing, they get raped, they get harassed, they get killed. So I just wanted to pause and say that question, as we're going to get to explore it, is a very heavily gendered one. Just wanted to leave it with you. Yeah. And of course, taking the intersectionality, and it's just not just like the gender aspect, there's so many other factors that come into play, and I hope to get to chat about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Craig.
Yeah, and thank you for that. As a father of daughters and my sisters, that is something that it's very interesting when you have a room, a mixed gendered room, when you ask women that question, and you find that men are very confused when they see that.
Yeah, it's
that
true.
Simply going to your car in an underground parking lot at night, and what has to go through your mind. And then the reaction we often get from men is, well, what's the issue? I'm one of the good guys. You always hear that kind of justification. But I think that part. So empathy is a big part of safety, right? Understanding safety is different, and it's not through your own worldview. And one of the challenges we have is a lot of policy decisions are generally made by individuals who are not in that precarious safety position. So safety is about having, your basic needs met, your survival needs met, food security, shelter, right? That's safety. And then there's a perspective that, safety means lack of, it's purely about, avoidance of violence or conflict. But safety is also about the presence of justice, the presence of fairness. That's also about safety, and understanding that, again, it is through an intersectional lens, and a part of what we do is at Black Opportunity Fund is to challenge ourselves and challenge our own biases to understand the various intersectionalities. And we also come from a place in Canada where we think, we're not like the US, we're better than them. And we don't really turn that lens to ourselves, but when you hear stats like, over the pandemic, the significant increase in anti-Asian hate attacks. In some places, 600% increase in anti-Asian hate attacks during the pandemic. In the 5 years previous to last year, I think there were more anti-Muslim murders through hate attacks in Canada than in any G7 country. But most people don't know that, right? So it's having that be open and be understanding, and I think empathy is a big piece of that, and having that understanding, and that everybody's journey is different. I mean, I've been a member of Toronto Chief of Police's Black Community Consultative Committee at one point in time, and you hear the 99.9% of police are good, and my response to that is there's no profession that 99.9% is good. Not plumbers, not carpenters, not the politicians, not executive directors. So that the first thing is to come from a place where you listen and you're open. I have an experience of outside of Hyde Park being in a routine traffic stop and having my car tires slashed with a knife by Toronto police. So in terms of safety, where is it you go for safety? For most people, you think police, law enforcement, security. But to many communities, it's completely the opposite. So, and interestingly, I have my son is an RCMP officer in Saskatchewan. And during his training, in a place where there's 3 indigenous communities close by, the Indigenous Cultural Awareness training was delivered by 3 white RCMP officers, right? So then you go in and you're deployed in there, and what have you, is that a safe situation for them, for the First Nations individuals that you're serving? So it means a number of things.
Thank you. Yasmin, same question to you about safety and what that means for you.
Yeah. So safety for me really is thinking about where I live and the community I live in. I don't think of it as safety. I think of it as making it a safer place to be, because I don't think there's safety anywhere. Working with the community that I live in, working with the folks that I work with, as I do a lot of frontline work with trans and gender diverse people and other folks, and think about how to incorporate different aspects of safety for us. But I think safety, as we move geographically and into different spaces, safety changes. And I think that's where the real challenge comes in, where I might feel safe in one place, and as I move to another place, I can feel really, really unsafe for whatever reason. And it's all because, of so many factors. People live in places or used to where they would feel safe. So everybody would gravitate to somewhere where I feel safe in this neighborhood, so I'm gonna go live there. Now we see people going where the rent is cheap, who may not necessarily want to live in certain places, which is a whole, other conversation based on, other factors, money, etc. So thinking about this, but also I think we had this conversation earlier on this week, is about how we work with other communities and other folks to make safety for all of us. Because we can find ourselves in a bubble and live in a form of silo at many times, where I live downtown, so all my focus is on where I live. How are we gonna make this safer? Who am I gonna talk to? How am I gonna talk to the MP? All these different folks, and then we tend to forget that we could work together with Craig in his neighborhood to talk about how we could do some cross, whatever, like at the community center in XYZ, or talk to Elaine about coming to the YWCA and talk about the community that comes there, and maybe do a Trans 101 workshop for them, and they get a better understanding of our community, and in return they will do something for us, so we get a better understanding of the needs and the community that they live in. And I feel like working around these pieces, again talking about intersectionality, which is a very loaded umbrella term that it takes all day to dissect and really get into it, about how intersectionality really works. But I think just working with other communities and understanding the needs and not doing the work in silo or just feeling like all I care about is the community that I live in and everybody else, that's their problem. Because my community feels safe, and that's fine.
Thank you for that. Scott, the same question for you about safety.
Took my answer. They all took my answer. So I think that, first of all, thank you for being here and thank you for participating in the session. And thanks to the panelists. It's an honor to be up here with these folks. I think I'll build off of what was said. I don't need to retell the same kind of points, but I think there's an individual sense of safety and there's a community sense of safety. And within the work that I'm trying to do is redefine what safety actually means by talking about the very thing that my new friends up here have mentioned, but also that Yasmin talked about up front when she dropped the stats about mental health, well-being, or homelessness. Those stats that were dropped are really about the well-being of people. And from where I'm coming from, safety in our city historically was about crime. That's how we thought about safety. And it was about, nuisances, crime, like those kind of things. And there's a perceived responses to crime. But really, it's about the well-being of people and places. And that has to be centered in the definition of safety. So for me, to answer what it is, I can't talk about safety without factoring in the well-being. And based on years of work that's happened in the city, there's a number of great leaders in the room here who've led some of that work. We've looked at the well-being of people differently. Toronto's a very prosperous city, and there's a lot of opportunity, but not everyone gets to equitably participate in that opportunity. And when that happens at systemic levels consistently, there are inequities that are driven in our community that impact the well-being of the people. And those inequities manifest in different ways, in poverty and racism, in some of the identity things that were mentioned, and people's ability to participate in the city impacts their well-being. And if that isn't addressed, that manifests and becomes the safety issue. So you can't talk about one without the other. And I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Lots of different amazing ideas to dive into from all the panelists. I want to maybe start with a couple of specific questions, and I thought maybe, Yasmin, it would be wonderful if we could start with some of the work that you do, which is kind of working closely with trans communities in our region through the 519 and the Trans Women and HIV Research Initiative. And we've all seen the recent media coverage around the transphobic protests and counter-protests originally centered around public school policies and gender identity, which are a really important reminder of the fact that trans communities are in a constant battle for their lives and for their rights. And so it's important for us to kind of think about those challenges and the well-being that trans communities experience. And so when we talk about safety and well-being from a community perspective, Yasmin, what does this mean for trans communities from your perspective and in your work? And how must we collectively work to create that safety for trans communities?
So it is a very loaded, sort of complex question, and about, do we tell people, everybody's quite familiar with it, right? So it's a very, there's a bit of a gray area. There's a bit of a black and white where it's some people are totally, yes, we should have it. Some people are, no, we don't want, this being taught in school. So in many ways, the work that we've done, I've worked a lot in education and training. That's my background. So we did a lot of education training around this in many, ways to get part of it being covered under the Ontario Human Rights Code. However, when it comes to the school, it's quite different. They don't necessarily have to, fall under it. I can't really tell people what to do or what to think. I think that's really up to each person for themselves to make that choice. For me, what I have seen and a lot of the work that I've done, when people are able to have this kind of form of protection, people are able to have better lives. And especially in a school environment where it's so complex in it's by itself. And then if you can't be your real self or your true self or your authentic self, then it becomes even an added layer to being in school and having to deal with all the other issues. So that's the feedback, I have received from the younger folks around it. However, it's a very, it is a contentious issue in terms of the families and folks telling families, well, you should do this or shouldn't do that. But I think maybe we need to just scale back and look at the Ontario Human Rights Code and see how that, covers the protection of gender identity and gender expression, and maybe talk more to the kids about this and see, get their feedback. But it is a very complex, I think it's ongoing. I don't think there's an actual answer to it, like this is the answer and it's all done. I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation that we need to have. And we need to have it like with ourselves and again with our communities.
Yeah, you mentioned not working in silos and making sure that we're kind of collaborating and working, aligning our efforts. Are there examples of that you feel are pieces that we should really center in that conversation?
I think working, a lot with Indigenous communities and having training from Indigenous communities, bring it back and teach us the early learnings and the real learnings of how really this is about colonization too, right? A huge part of it is based in that. Although, a lot of folks don't want to get into that. And they're like, no, this is an issue about gender identity, but it all goes back because we know in Indigenous culture, Two-Spirit is a valid, identity, and, it was erased due to colonization. Those of you who have had Indigenous training are probably aware of it. Some of you haven't, but I could just give you a quick little, 101, 201 on it. So in Indigenous culture, upon colonization, what, settlers saw was Indigenous communities who had folks who were probably male identified dressed as woman identified dressed as male, but they were leaders in the community. So they were held with these certain responsibilities. Of course, the colonizers didn't like this. So what they decided to do was to erase this identity altogether. And the way they decide to do it is by having these folks eaten alive by dogs. So not only did they want to erase them in in a horrific way, but to make sure that this doesn't exist. And we have drawings and paintings and stuff that has survived, this. Now that's a reclaiming Indigenous culture called Two-Spirit. So this is just part of it also. So the long history of all these, forms of oppression is playing out in many ways.
Thank you. Thank you for that, really learning from our Indigenous communities. Maybe I'll turn to Aline with a question for you in your work. You lead YWCA Canada. And so I'm sure this is, the topic of community safety is one that you think of a lot, and you mentioned the experiences of women and how we can really advocate for women and gender diverse communities. YWCA Canada recently released a research report on strategies to inform Canada's National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, which acknowledged that women, girls, and gender diverse people are at heightened risk of experiencing gender-based violence, particularly those who have visible or invisible disabilities and or who are Indigenous, Black, or racialized. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective what insights this research or from your own experience that you're able to share with us as it relates to, kind of building that sense of community safety and looking at the audiences that you serve.
Thank you so much. And it's been just great to hear from everyone here on the panel. So gender-based violence is one of the 4 pillars of focus that we work on at YWCA Canada at the national level. Locally, that can also include other things like housing, employment, childcare, and all kinds of other social programming that we do to help women rebuild their lives. And so when we're not safe in places, so if we bring it back to the home, for example, when we're not safe in places where we live, where do we go when that happens? You know, that's a question that we have to ask, and that shaped a lot of the feedback that was provided in that report that was responding to the government of Canada unveiling a national action plan to end gender-based violence. By the way, that's something that we contributed to quite a lot extensively. We are very proud of that action plan in place, and how the YWCA really showed up to shape the conversations. So when we're not safe, you know, we leave the home, and then we try to figure out where to go. And so what we know now is that the shelter places that are supposed to welcome people who are fleeing violence, especially women, girls, and gender diverse people, are full to the brims. They're full, they're at capacity, there's not enough. We know that 6,000 people, women and families, that means their children and women-led households, are sleeping in shelters every night across Canada. And now we know that shelters turn around 1,000 women and children because there's no space. So where do you go when you need to have that protection? And you know, you're not safe with your partner at home or with your family. That's the same reality for youth. And oftentimes when you add that gender element, so queer youth, LGBTQ youth, and then oftentimes when you add that element of racialized, Black or Indigenous, that's even, we have even greater rates of despair. If we always work to center the experiences of Black, racialized, and Indigenous communities, because they're still at the receiving end of a lot of that violence. If we talk about Indigenous women, we know that they're 6 times more likely to be at the receiving end of violence, including just the whole range of what that is. And so that's simply just not acceptable. And we know that it shows up as intra-community violence, but we know it's linked, as you were saying, to colonialism and to the impact of residential schools. And so, and just, you know, the impact of living in broken communities. And so what are some of the systems that are in place to address those challenges, really, and then addressing them at the root? So what that report was talking about was really to give voice to the survivors, to tell us what we need to be doing. And what we heard was that we need holistic solutions to create the social infrastructure that we need to have in place to feel safe. And so when I mean holistic, I mean WHOLE, whole. That includes a whole range of services that we need to have that need to be centering the experience and engaging the experience of people who are survivors and who are experiencing increased levels of gender inequity in terms of safety. So that's something that we saw really is adding to the public policy discourse, and we just would love to see that continue as we see the government unveiling bilateral agreements with provinces to really implement this national action plan against gender-based violence.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think the conversation around public policy and what our policymakers do is a really important layer to this conversation. And so I think it would be great if we could shift ourselves a little bit in terms of, you know, looking at some of those institutions in this conversation. Scott,
one additional element that I cannot forget, and it's also stemming from some of our work, was how that safety, and also that we are talking about in physical places, also shows up in online spaces, and how that's also a gendered experience when you're adding all the other identity factors that shape those experiences. So our Block Hate work, so we did a 4-year program called Block Hate, and it was titled Building Resilience Against Online Hate Speech. It was funded by Public Safety Canada. And so what we did was work with some of the people who were facing online hate speech. We work a lot with young people. Yeah. And then one of the ways where they show solidarity or they take action is to make their voices heard online, and just the backlash that we observed in hate speech against them. So calling really for the accountability and the responsibility of social media platforms and all these other places where we also exist, right? We're online, we're in the social media realm. What does safety look like there? And who's responsible to keep ourselves safe? And so just leaving it as a question. But I know it's a rhetorical one, but there are answers too. And I'm sure they're probably around here in the room and on this panel. So yeah, just lots to think about.
Does anyone want to add in terms of the physical spaces, online spaces conversation?
I think the answer to who's responsible is everybody. And I think that's important because generally the burden is on those who are victims on responding. And I think that's where, when we have discussions about what true allyship means, is using your place of privilege and risking your privilege in order to support those who don't have it. And we don't see true allyship enough. Right? And I think that is very important. But as you said, the stats are, out of control. The leading cause of homicide of women is intimate partner violence. And yet when we see, the Me Too movement, what do we see? There's always a response. So what was the response we heard from men? Oh, it's an attack on men. You always hear this foolishness, right? Where everybody feels that equity is like pie, right? So if somebody gets a piece of pie, that means I get less. And it's not, it's additive, right? And we have to think about that. If any group is not allowed to fulfill their potential to be completely safe, then we as a country have failed. So we have to, again, all of us have to understand our privilege, and all of us need to be able to lean in to help those who don't.
Absolutely.
I think just one other point. It was about the online space, and it comes out of Craig's comments around inequities, and if there's someone who, I'll go back to my opening remarks. When there are people who can't participate, they find ways to participate, and the online space is a very interesting development in our, in our sectors, and to be honest, most sectors haven't really embraced that space, only to become a traditional, let's blitz people with messaging, and not engage in that space. But the people who are engaging in that space are redefining themselves. And so in some of our programs, we work with young people in the city who haven't got to equitably participate. So they recreate themselves as a persona in this virtual world as someone who can participate. And in some cases, that's to pursue opportunities, and they leverage that to do so. And it's a great vehicle. But in other ways, depending on what someone may be involved in, they may be positioning themselves as having power over others and utilizing that. And what happens is others who are in that same mind frame go at each other online. And if you think about community safety issues, that is a new escalation point that has come out of the technology. And from my point of view, I know young people who've explained to me that their virtual persona is more important to them than who they are in the day-to-day life. And they will protect that persona. So if the persona is based in greatness, they're going to do everything they can to protect that and pursue that and create an image or brand, as we like to talk about. However, if that is in power or rooted in violence or misogyny, to your point, I've seen that turn to victimization faster than any intervention can interrupt, because one's own identity is so wrapped up in a virtual world versus how they are, and they will sacrifice their morals within a real space to defend the virtual one. And I think that's something that no sector here is really truly thinking about, is the impact of that. And on both sides of it, there's great power there and there's great opportunity. There's also tremendous risk.
I want to create the space for Yasmin if there's anything you'd like to kind of on the question of physical and online spaces.
I was just thinking about accessibility because, technology is so in our face, but there are many folks who just can't access, stuff, and they're afterthought, right? So if you want to build a safer community and all you're thinking about is, we'll send out a survey to all the communities, everybody fill this out, we'll get the responses, and we'll know 44% of the people are living under. But what about the people who can, who can have access to it? They don't have access to the internet. They don't have access to a mobile phone or to the app or to, all the pieces. I don't think I have to go into, we totally forget about them. And it's a lot of folks at a certain or particular age who don't have this, access to access.
Yeah, and with regard to the online, so in my previous life, CBC, CTV were clients of mine in terms of their audience relations and so on, and helping them in terms of coming up with their social media guidelines and responses for shows like The Talk. And CBC notices that there's spikes in terms of the attacks on social media, attacks on Black people tend to go up during Black History Month. And in during Pride Month, the attacks go up against the 2S LGBTQ2+ community, Indigenous awareness. There's always these spikes. So, but it's interesting in how you navigate those spaces. One of the things that I find is it really lets you know what the tone is, because you find that people are more courageous, or they think there's anonymity in their social media presence, and they'll say things that they won't say to your face or beside you. So sometimes seeing that is kind of a gauge of society. So I think, rather than silencing, I'm always about, I want to know exactly. It's like in the US, when the tone went up through it was a pretty good bellwether to say. I remember, colleagues of mine who had worked in the US, had worked in Washington, and I remember they were saying, oh yeah, Trump's not going to get out of the primaries. I'm like, no, he's going to win. And then when he got out of the primaries, oh, he'll never get the thing. Oh, no, he's going to win. I'm like, why? Because you can see it. You can see the tone. But what the narrative we have is, we come from a place where we think the world is better than it is. We think our society is better than it is. And what did we hear? Well, it's a small percentage of the population who thinks that way. And the reality is it's not. And I think the first thing is to understand that reality, so that when you're strategizing from a place of reality rather than from Disneyland. All right, the reality is very different from different people, for different people, based on your identities, based on intersectionality. And it's very easy, especially with social media, especially with media and the algorithms, to get caught in your bubble and think that your worldview is the only or is the majority view.
Yeah.
So it's usually a shock once you come out of it, right? And this is why I always say, people don't uncover their own biases for the same reason fish don't discover water, because you live in it 24/7. So the only time when fish discover water is when you pull them out of it. And then it's a shock to the system, and they fight like hell to get back into that environment. And it's the same with bias and privileges and what you've grown up with. So you really have to make that effort. And part of that is having uncomfortable conversations. And one thing's with a lot of the EDI work, a lot of it is just really checkboxing, and a lot of organizations have come in, especially since George Floyd, made a lot of money gone into corporate spaces or government spaces, and the focus was, let's not make people uncomfortable, let's get the check, get out, so that they can tick it off and go back to exploiting people the next day. And a lot of the conversations were just, you weren't prepared to allow people to have difficult conversations, right? And be uncomfortable. And create a safe space for people to ask those questions. Like 2 months ago, I was in Edmonton and I led an inclusive leadership session for leadership team, police, and fire. And really just provided an opportunity for conversations, safe conversations, to say whatever the heck you're feeling, right? And if you feel, you know what, this EDI stuff, we've gone too far with it. Let's have that conversation, right? You know, with, 18,000 fire persons in Edmonton, and 18 of them are women. Let's have that conversation, right?
And what you're saying is sparking so much thought, but I think the precarity, like when you're talking about that bubble, and the precarity of any sense of safety that we sometimes have when we are in such a rapidly evolving tech facilitated world, where misinformation and just playing with people's fears and discomfort can just ignite hate just like that. We know that violence usually takes time to foment and form, but it starts in some of that rhetoric. So wherever you're hearing the rhetoric or dehumanization, discrimination, and bullying, that may look like it's not that dangerous, but it takes a little more tweaking of some of of what people are hearing. And if you add that to just experiences of poverty and discrimination and colonization and people being their last, that moment where you just need a little ignition to act, we know that it's really, really critical that we have these conversations and we create those safe spaces where we can talk about everything. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and it's an important conversation, like reconciling that, the conversations that, folks have online versus and having those conversations and having, being able to have dialogue, offline, I think is a skill that, we know is a challenge. A lot of organizations have reported that in terms of just kind of that challenge of having, real conversations that, allow us to kind of navigate our views together and how people don't feel like they're enabled to do that, or they don't have the ability to do that, I think now in conversations that they have that are not online. So I think that, I agree. It's a lot of reconciling we have to do. Are there strategies that you have seen work or tactics that we can turn to, maybe in this kind of reconciling between online and offline, and how we have those conversations?
Well, you really need, I'd say one sentence, you need coordinated action amongst all the players. You just can't have, we've seen some of the, if we talk about online spaces, the platforms that are sort of introducing measures people can take to be safe. But if it's just this one platform and there's these other 5 ones that are not doing anything, or the police is not informed about some of these other new ways where people are being, harassed or hated on. You just need to have that coordination and have lawmakers be aware that this needs to happen. And it's a continued kind of set of action they need.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of a policy response on social media, I mean, the challenge we have is policy is years behind because the technology moves so rapidly. But I mean, it's so there needs to be a policy response. I mean, we've seen because of in the States, Congress has pushed a lot for some kind of a response from the Facebooks and the so on in terms of attacking and policing hate speech and so on. So we've seen that start, but they're more subtle things. I mean, Facebook just a couple of years ago through Facebook, through their real estate app, they were found, they faced a lawsuit for digital redlining, where they were allowing people to, advertise real estate through Facebook, but specifically exclude people of certain races or people of certain, these are practices. So when we talk about it, it's not just the vitriol and hate. There are other ways that, social media can be weaponized to, attack people and discriminate against people. But yeah, so there needs to be a policy response, and I know the Canadian government is looking at how do we address this. But the balancing act is, the freedom of speech and how do you manage that. But there needs to be some kind of a policy response, and there needs to be some kind of consistent way that it is done. And I know, again, that is, no country in the world has figured that out yet, but it is something that there needs to be significant attention to. And then the decision, the big problem is then when you're making those decisions is who is making the decisions on what is hate and what is not. Who is making decisions on what is discrimination and what is not? Because there's usually the power imbalance in terms of those decisions. That decision making is also a big part of the problem, and also the imbalance in terms of who is making the policy decisions. Because if you take a look at the majority of policymakers in Canada, they don't look like the people who are at the end of a lot of these vitrials and attacks.
Yeah. I guess on the note of policymakers and the public sector, I guess maybe I'll turn it over to you, Scott, and I'd love to kind of hear a little bit, and I think this is a big conversation in terms of the online, offline. You do a lot of work through SafeTO, and there's been a lot of efforts, I think, underway in terms of reimagining community safety and what that means and how we talk about it and how we achieve it. And so I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about some of that work and as it relates to this conversation that we're having here.
Sure, thank you. I'm nerding out because you called me a policymaker. In my background, you would laugh that I'm sitting up here, that I work at City Hall, and that you're calling me a policymaker. So thank you. It's really, I'm blushing. So I come from the ground. That's my background. And so I think I'll say it this way. From a policy perspective, everything they said, through SafeTO, we're providing a multi-sector approach. No one entity can deal with the complexity and sometimes urgency of community safety and well-being issues. We can't wait for policy. We need to act, but we need to develop policy in real time. And the two need to be interwoven. Policy and research can't be off doing, God's work and show up 50 years later after you've moved on from the issue. It needs to be embedded in the action. And so what we're trying to do is integrate it in real time. We're doing it through bringing multiple sectors together. We're bringing audiences, different institutions working out of one space on interventions like gun violence reduction, on the integration of data, on the cross-sectoral analytics that we need to look at a regular basis. So as a city, we're doing that. The second thing is courageous conversations. And so, we can define the most fanciest interventions in the world. If they're not touching community, they're not going to be successful. So I'm going to give shout outs to the room. I work with Peter Slowly on the development and implementation of Focus Toronto, and we were getting excited because we were actually making some headway. And he kept reminding us, you can't just work with the systems, we needed to take it back to community. So you need leaders that are grounded in that. You also need leaders who can take community voice and translate it in the system. Next shout out goes to Nadia in the back. I was at a Raptor Summit about a year ago, and a young person was, really speaking very honestly about their interactions with Toronto Community Housing. And Nadia was able to say, the people up here don't understand you, but I do. And I'm going to translate that and take it back into my organization. And I make that commitment to you today. And the young person felt heard and validated. I used to work with Roseanne Bailey over here. I remember a terrible shooting in the Sheridan Mall in the Jane and Wilson area, where we're trying to balance being on the ground with residents and, the need to update counselors and all this sort of stuff. And Roseanne reminding me that, we got these partners here, they're on the ground, and we need to work with them right now. That's the priority, not all the noise. Let's deal with the people. I used to work with Janet Fitzsimmons in the Out of the Cold, and I would be leading the Out of the Cold. And, I would be talking about how many people were sleeping that night. And Jan's like, I don't give a damn about that. This woman's pregnant. She's going to go out in the morning. She's got nowhere to go. We need to act now. And so you need those kind of balances. And the only way you can get the balance is by empowering different perspectives to be part of the equation. And to Craig's point, residents have to be part of that. They have to be central in that. And you need to create the ability and the conditions for them to participate equitably.
Thank you so much for that.
Can I just
Please,
real
absolutely.
quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of an overarching public health approach in terms of things like gang violence prevention. We actually did a couple of years ago. We brought in Chief Guillermo Cespedes from LA, who was the chief of violence prevention. I mean, in terms of gun violence prevention, on violence prevention, a lot of the things we do are downstream approaches, and the reaction to violence is usually over-policing, it's incarceration. And if that worked, then the US would be the safest place in the world because it has the highest incarcerated population in the world. But if you go upstream and look at the social determinants, that's where you will solve it. But we spend way too much time downstream and not upstream. I mean, a few years ago, Glasgow, Scotland led Europe in violent crime. And over a 10-year period, through a public health approach, reduced it by 70%, right? Yeah. But also the approaches we use also are usually predicated on what is the race, the religion of the individual and the community. And interesting, when you map the areas where gun violence, gang violence are the highest, during the pandemic, it's the exact same places where and we should have known that.
Yeah.
We should have known that. So the root causes are the same and the solutions are the same, but we spend our time downstream when we should be going upstream and figuring out why people are in the water, falling in the water, right?
Absolutely. I noticed that Mohammed Hashim, our moderator, his flight has landed. We're so happy you're here. I'd love to invite you up to kind of close out the panel, add some remarks as well, if that works for you.
Hi, Mohammed.
Thank you. You have to be on time for these things, I guess. Right? No, I'm sorry. I was yesterday. And today there's a meeting of all the federal and provincial and territorial ministers of public safety and justice that are coming together in Quebec right now. So we had to brief them yesterday, and getting back here was a bit of a struggle. So my sincere apologies, but it was important for me to be there. I couldn't miss it, or else I get fired. I was listening to the panel, and I think there's a lot of threads that I just want to kind of pull together. One, in terms of the online space. It is horrific. And it's getting worse and worse. And to be honest, we get to see some of the legislation coming up. I don't know if the legislation that's going to come up is going to plug that hole in 5, 10, 15 years.
Yep.
I don't know. It's accelerating so fast. I honestly cannot tell you with a sense of confidence that this is going to solve it. I also know, we have curated our experiences online to hear and validate our own joys and fears in a way that we can't see anybody else. We don't even want to hear anybody else. And that's not just policymakers, that's us.
Yeah.
That's us too. We are surrounded, honestly, we've been surrounded by pain recently. I'm just over it. I'm so sick. I'm both annoyed and sorrow and rage. When we're watching anti-trans marches, it's insane that this is happening in Canada. We're going backwards.
Yeah.
We saw so much support during the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the lead up, and when George Floyd was murdered, all of a sudden society became really, really woke on anti-Black racism.
Yeah.
And then, like, they say you die twice. Once when you take your last breath, and the last is when your name is mentioned for the last time. I don't hear George Floyd's name anymore right now. Not in any policy forum that I'm in. And that's horrible. And, obviously, I'm not going to sit here and not address what is happening across this world right now. There are people who are hurting. I was speaking to Yara Sachs, the Minister for Mental Health, a couple of days ago. She is worried sick because her best friend is burying her child. And she's sick as hell because her friends in Gaza don't have a way to come out. One of my staff members told me that her friends in Gaza are separating their kids right now. They have 6 kids, 2 kids without family, 2 kids without family, 2 kids without family. Why? Because they don't want everyone to die together. There is, in Canada, what is happening over there is hurting all of us over here. And sorry for swearing, but like, I can't stand it. I can't stand it, honestly. Like, where are the wise people in this world who get up and say, stop, we're not gonna let kids and women get killed anymore. No blood shall be spilled. Where are these people in this world right now? I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to have a kid worrying about a rocket coming from the sky and what shelter to run to. I don't want to have a kid looking in the sky and seeing rubble around him and bombs destroying their homes. I want kids to look up to the sky and see stars and dream. Where are the wise people in this world that will say, stop? I don't know. I honestly don't know. And I think that when we talk about policymakers and doing it with community, I think there's no greater touch that I've written nothing on this over the last couple of days because I didn't have the words to explain it, and I don't. I'm sorry if I'm just rambling on. But like, I just honestly think that like, our connections to each other need to be deeper, not just online. We can't sit behind a screen and expect to be friends with each other. We need to make tangible investments in our own time to talk to people across different aisles, because that environment is pulling us apart. You and I will pull each other together. And that's the only thing that's gonna save us. Whether it's creating a sense of safety for our different types of identities, which are furiously under attack all the time. It needs to happen. Our investments shouldn't necessarily just be looking to government to solve our issues. Our investments need to figure out how do we actually work together. And I'm gonna stop there because we're over time already, I believe. And I'm sorry to ramble on, but I had to kind of just get that out there.
Yeah.
But also identify that like there's a lot of people in this world that are in severe pain.
Yeah.
And I just want you to reach out and give them a hug a little bit, because this is the time when they need it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Aline, Craig, Scott, Mohammed, Yasmin, thank you sincerely. I think you've given us so much to think about, and we're incredibly grateful. And I know that I'm walking out of this conversation knowing that there's a lot of work to do, and that we are only able to accomplish it if we get out of the spaces where we're in individually and we can talk more. And so thank you very much for giving us so much to think about. Before we close out, just a quick note. There's a survey that you'll get through the Whova app about this session. We'd love to hear your feedback on this conversation. So please please do provide us with your feedback through that survey. And up next in the agenda is a lunch break. So I hope everyone gets to recuperate a bit from this conversation. And I encourage you to visit our networking lounge, where you can learn a little bit about civic action programs over the course of the lunch. So thank you so much again to our panelists and to Mohammed.
Thanks, Yasmin.